morning, everybody. Good morning. Hello. My name's Peter Bonfield. I'm Chief Executive of BRE, and I'm going to chair this first session. But before that, I'd like to welcome you all here. A number of you I know have had quite challenging journeys. We don't have a topic actually in our city's convention on transport reliability and functionality, but there are a number of problems on the tube. So you'll have to bear with people coming in and join us during the morning. Anyway, welcome here. Spectacular venue. If any of you flag during the day or during tomorrow, just take a look out the window, gather some energy from this amazing city, draw it in, and get more energy for attending to and listening to and engaging in the presentations. But I don't think you're going to have any problem for that, because over the next 2 days we have an absolutely tremendous array of speakers, starting off with the morning speakers on connectivity, but we're looking at resilience, we're looking at financing, a whole array of aspects that are relevant to cities. Also, you that are attending, if you look down the attendance list, you'll see we've got a really nice mix of talent, people, interest, public sector, private sector, third sector, people who collectively, if we collectively get and buy into the needs around cities, then we can create our own movement that makes better outcomes happen, that addresses a whole array of challenges and opportunities, how we deploy data, how we create healthier places, how we use sensors and other things to manage more effectively, because so much is changing, isn't it? We've got much of the world's population is moving to cities. We've got all sorts of pressures on resources. We've got the climate changing, changing demographics, different wealth streams, challenges over supply of energy and other resources and how they're used and how we deal with waste. Anyway, a whole array of topics. Rich, vibrant, and a great thing to cluster around and make progress on. So I'll say more about our morning speakers in a minute, but just some housekeeping matters. If there's a fire alarm, you can exit out here or round the other side of where you had coffee. You go downstairs, you turn right to the Tate Modern Building and cluster just around there. And you cluster on floor 6, okay? There are no fire alarms planned, so if you hear the fire alarm, we'll just exit and do that. Other practical things for your Wi-Fi, the code, if you want the code, it's venue123, and it's lowercase v, so venue123. The Twitter hashtag is Cities Convention, do that. And the sort of link place, if you like, the @place to link to is @BRE events, okay? So do be active, do tweet, do take pictures, do exploit technology, and let's connect with people outside as well as those inside. The other thing we're going to be doing too is we're going to be filming all the presentations and the discussions, and in a true sort of open data type way, we hope to get, well, we won't hope to, we're going to get it out there and use this again and again and again to stimulate better outcomes, thinking, action. Anyway, so you're very welcome. Let me introduce our 3 speakers, and I'm going to introduce you all first, so you can just come up and speak. What I'd like you to do, please, is to have some amazingly insightful, energizing, useful questions to raise at the end of the session. We'll let all 3 speakers do their thing, and then we'll have a little discussion at the end, so please do that. And so our 3 speakers, first speaker is Sir Alan Wilson, who's Professor of Urban and Regional Systems at the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis at University College London. He also is Chair of the Home Office Science Advisory Council and of the lead expert group for Go Science Foresight project on the future of cities. So he is absolutely connected in and leading on something for the government that's looking forward about how science and engineering is best deployed in the interest of our cities. It's venue. You go to the venue one, and then it's venues 1, 2, 3. No, I realise that. Is it venues and Wi-Fi? How to queue off? Yeah, venue Wi-Fi, and then you put a pass of venues 1, 2, 3. So the Wi-Fi is up and down at the moment, so. Anyway, like the tubes, right? We need reliable, intuitive, even for very bright people, systems and digital systems that work and connect well. good question for later. Right, so let me carry on with Sir Alan. Anyway, Alan, you're a great chap. Former Vice-Chancellor of Leeds University, a real privilege, honour to have you here, and we're very much looking forward to what you have to say. Then we've got Brian Kilkelly coming, who's the CEO and founder partner of the World Cities Network. Super passionate about business and city leaders, bringing them together to find ways to make our cities more sustainable. So we've got a bunch of those people here. Okay, look forward to helping you bring us together. Brian was prior to this, Brian was Senior Vice President of the Global Partnerships at the Open Land Institute in London, and has done loads of great stuff around urban development and network. Privileged to have you here too. And then our last speaker is Dr. Tom Heath, who's the head of research at the Open Data Institute. And believe me, being head of research at the Open Data Institute, where they're trying all sorts of new things in new ways that nobody's thought about before, without loads of engineering and science forefathers to build on, that is a pretty challenging, awesome job, great opportunity. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from you about your view from the Open Data Institute about how things need to go forward. Okay, so without further ado, Sir Alan, could I ask you to give us your presentation?
Thank you. Is the mic? I'll use.
Oh, we've got a mic there. Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and thank you for that introduction. I've given myself this title, New Data, very much a theme for this meeting. And my own theme is really, what do we do with it when we get it? And how is it going to change what I'm calling the science of cities? Now, nullius in verba is actually the motto of the Royal Society. It's actually very difficult to translate. If you go into Google Translate, you don't necessarily get anything very sensible, but it roughly translates as don't take anybody's word for it, and it means that science needs data. What we now have is the big data revolution. I'll classify it a bit more in a minute, but there are really two main dimensions: the very fast to the slow, real-time sensors and census data, opposite ends of that, and open to closed. So lots of real-time data is open, like Twitter data. Census is pretty open, and then we have lots of closed data, which as scientists and analysts would actually quite like to get our hands on, but lots of problems with that. So some of that in a bit more detail. What we know about, what we start with, is census data. It gets translated into things like geodemographics, and then the real-time data, the kind of things that our mobile phone companies get from location data. They know where we are all the time, even when our phones are switched off. What can be done with that? And then linking it with other fast data, again, something I'll get onto in a second. Admin data is only part open, so health data, pretty rich, but mostly not open. Education similarly. HMRC, as an analyst, I'd love to know more about people's incomes in different parts of cities, how it interacts with the employment market. Can't get it for obvious reasons, it's all closed. How do we tackle all that? And then the really closed data, or at least we hope it's really closed, is what our banks know about us through accounts, spending, all the rest of it. But literally thousands of data sources available. And a lot of the power of that is going to come from linking and translating data into new uses. I'm going to say a little bit about the use of models in retailing. And the data for that was always collected by market researchers or to an extent the retailers themselves. A company like Telefonica now has this huge number of records per day on where we all are if you have an O2 phone. And they've now translated that into estimates of flows into retail centres. So you can actually do another kind of modelling on that data to transform it into, in effect, another kind of data. Think then about linking mobile phone data with automatic number plate recognition, with CCTV data, and you get into territory that the police, security services, and so on are potentially very interested in. And again, a very wide range of applications, but real privacy issues. And then I allowed myself another bit of Latin to try and give the opposite end of another spectrum in relation to the Royal Society's motto. And that translates, I got this from Google Translation the other way around. I put the English in until I got a sensible looking Latin phrase, but it actually means that we need theory and understanding as well as the data. And so it's the science with new data that I actually want to talk about. In the case of cities, it's about building urban models, mathematical models, computer models. For my sins, I realised last year I'd passed the 50th anniversary of my work on urban modelling, so I'm a long-standing figure in this field. What are we trying to model? Left-hand side of this diagram, people in cities, total population, where people live, work, use a whole range of services. Right-hand side of the diagram, the economy of cities, how that delivers housing, jobs, products, services. In principle, very complicated, linked by transport and telecoms, carried on, the whole thing carried on infrastructure in an urban environment. So against that background, what are we trying to model? So I'll now switch into computer modeling for a bit, and then I'll link it back to new data. Behavior of people, where we all work, shop, live. In principle, we can model all of that. We need indices of attractiveness of different kinds of places. We can then begin to build utility functions, preferences for different kinds of people. We can do that for different kind of organisations in the economy. We need to describe cities at different scales, different sectors, spatial scales. We have zoning systems, 620 wards in London if you want to do a ward-based model of London, different timescales. I wanted an exercise for myself where I made some actually quite conservative judgments about how fine-grained I would quite like to build a comprehensive urban model, how many variables would that give me in my computer model, and the answer I got for this particular exercise was 10 to the 13. So, you know, a big number, and, you know, it sort of illustrates the complexity of the system. And then we want to model dynamics, and there are really two kinds of dynamics. Transport, retail. If something changes, the system readapts very quickly. It moves to a new equilibrium very quickly. With the structure of the city, buildings, infrastructure, it's slowly changing, and that gives you a much harder modelling challenge. So if you think back to my diagram, what we're modelling is demography. We've got good economic models. In principle, all the technologies there for building input-output models of cities, but because in this case we haven't got the data and still don't know how to get it, of flows across city boundaries, city region boundaries, we can't build good input-output models. So the Treasury will have input-output models for cities. Out of that, they can get balance of payments. That's obviously an important economic indicator for the country. In principle, we could do the same kind of things for cities. And then we could say something about the relative performances of cities and what the policy issues would be then for the cities that are not doing so well. Which sectors do you try to invest in? But that's an area where we've got really a research gap. Transport is, it's been excellent in modelling for decades, so has retail. And then it gets a bit harder. We're not bad on residential location and housing. It gets harder when you get into the economy and infrastructure. So if we can build these kinds of models, what are the applications? In government, in transport, it's relatively routine. Cost-benefit analysis of new possible projects, then start to choose. It could be used much more widely in planning than it actually is. Housing, and at the moment planners, I would argue, are not really using the analytical capabilities that we've got. So there are concepts within planning of something like housing market areas, the HMAs, and they're non-overlapping areas. And part of arguments in planning is about what happens in an area. And of course, people cross boundaries all the time. And if you're doing the modelling properly, you can handle all that. So there are potential developments there. And through to the long term. So what we're trying to do with the Foresight Future of Cities programme is look at 25-year, 50-year time horizons and make some speculations about that, because you certainly can't forecast over that kind of period, and that gets you into development of scenarios. Now, I don't know why I put these slides in. I've got 3 slides that say this is what a model of London looks like. This one actually illustrates what you can do. It's putting 50,000 jobs in a potential new airport, which are the coloured blobs, the brighter coloured blobs in the Thames estuary. Put 50,000 jobs there, rerun the model. It will tell you what will happen to housing, where people will live, and so on and so on and so on. And it will calculate a whole batch of indicators. And then I always want to say with urban modelling that everything's actually joined up, and every now and again people produce these kind of diagrams to illustrate that. I always quite like using this slide. 1 or 2 people like Brian have seen it before if you've heard me talk about this. I usually use this if I'm introducing the Foresight project. If we're trying to look a long way ahead, it's actually quite interesting to look at the previous 100 years. And these are the ranks. It's actually for primary urban areas of population in cities over 100 years. And the top 10 are pretty stable in terms of rank. You know, London's at the top. But you can see what the volatility is in the rest. So I actually take this as a warning that if we're actually trying to think about the UK system of cities in the next 50 years, we need to bear in mind that kind of volatility. So lots of applications in government, both central and local. And then the second area is commercial. No supermarket company would think about investing in a new site unless they'd run the models to predict what the revenue would be, and that can be done pretty accurately. Anything that involves a consumer flow, a user flow into a facility, you can do this kind of modelling. So schools, hospitals, universities, as well as the commercial stuff. I usually throw this slide in because if anybody who doesn't know about these kind of models think, you know, it's all pie in the sky stuff. I was involved late 80s, early 90s with setting up a university spin-out company called GMAP, doing this kind of modelling. And these are GMAP clients, and they were paying GMAP a lot of money to run these models to plan their networks optimally. And most of these companies have now internalised this kind of facility. And I guess one of the points that I want to make is because it's fairly easy to see the benefits of this kind of modelling in the commercial sector, it's actually more systematically used in the commercial sector than it is in the government sector. And there's a challenge there for us in the longer run. So we have pretty good models. I won't go through the detail of all this. I've said if I say we've got pretty good models, it makes it sound easier than it is. For some of it, it actually works very well. Some of it is still a research challenge. If you've got large numbers of people, if you're trying to model transport flows, we've got fantastically good models. Same with retail. If you're trying to model parts of the economy where the numbers of organisations are very small, then obviously intuitively you can see that the modelling is much more difficult, and in that case you're trying to model the conditions under which you might, for example, attract inward investment. So, a lot of great variety of models, but lots available to press on with this. And I think this slide is just saying the real research frontier is dynamic modelling, how cities are likely to grow over long periods. But just to round off at the end, that gives you an introduction to data modelling uses. What will change in the big data era? And I think what's happening now, for example, with the Smart Cities agenda, is a tremendous number of what I've called here operational research applications in particular areas, all of which will be very important for the fields in which they work. It'll be very important, actually, to make cities more efficient. And then there's a sort of longer-term use, which is to feed some of this into the planning system. And then back to scenarios again for the long term. So that's good. It will enhance our modelling capabilities. If we can use Telefonica type of data in retail models, it actually means you don't have to do a survey and then do another one 5 years down the line. It means you can actually do your modelling in real time because you have a real-time data flow. And you know that again is not yet happening, but I would have said within a very short time it will be happening. So this is my last slide, I think, which in which I attempt to summarise what I think the challenge is. On the left-hand side of that, it recognises in very, very broad terms the kind of data that I've been talking about. There's what I call core data, which is the census data is probably the best example. There's a whole host of real-time data. And in fact, there's a whole, because of the government's open data policy, there's much more available in the core data area as well. So all that can be, as it were, spelled out. And there's quite a lot known in the planning side about what we're trying to achieve in terms of densities and so on. In the case of the real-time data, the sheer volume of it means that you've got you've got a preliminary sort of analysis problem, which is the box that says organising system. Something's taking all that in and it's putting something sensible that you want to know about out. And I would see that then as a flow into the big box in the middle, which is an information system where the data's been cleaned up, you've made your decisions about zones and times and sectors, and and developing a proper architecture for that, I think, is a big research problem. I think there are rudimentary forms of this around, but there's nothing, as it were, big and organised. And it's one of my dreams has been to see that kind of system in place. That then gives us the database for the box on the right-hand side, which is to build the kind of models that I've been talking about. More broadly, what is now being called, actually a rather good phrase, urban analytics. And out of that, you get model outputs, you get all sorts of useful, valuable indicators, revenue into a supermarket, demand for primary school places, different places, the whole shooting match. So you report all that, high-class visualization, and you can put some of that back into the information system again. So hence the arrows that go back for testing various scenarios. So I hope what that gives Peter is in a sense, a kind of baseline for almost the rest of the conference, because a lot of it is about new data, a lot of it is about analysis. And so what I was hoping to offer at the start is a kind of framework so you can see what can be done and what the research challenges are. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Peter, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's great to be at altitude today and to be talking about my favourite subject, which of course is cities. And the title of my topic this morning is Power to the People. And I think the answer and the challenge, as Alan has very eloquently outlined, is very much related to people. We have the data, we have the technology, we have many of the solutions. I guess my message today is that there is a good news story about how people are really revolutionizing cities, and there's a bad news story, which is that it's taking a long time for change to happen. It's taking a long time for people to adjust and to adapt. And certainly, I think the area of planning, as Alan outlined, is one of the areas that needs a lot of work on. So a little bit about World Cities Network, just to set some background. We work with about a dozen cities around the world. So we work in London, Paris, Toronto, San Francisco, Helsinki, Amsterdam, Barcelona. And we create a kind of a neutral space between the public sector and the private sector to look at ways in which we can make cities more resilient and more sustainable. So we run roundtables, workshops, very much looking at practically how does a city deal with some of its infrastructure, some of its real estate challenges. And I wanted to start off from the kind of investor, property developer viewpoint to root this in the kind of the commercial world, if you like. And I've got a couple of pictures here. One is shows a case study on Shanghai, and one is a case study on Vancouver. And it's from a report by Grosvenor, which I believe are here today. I think Victoria's here. Fantastic report that Grosvenor released last year, and they shared it at a conference we ran at the City of London. And basically, it shows you that actually investors and property developers are concerned about city resilience. They are thinking about it. And this ranking shows that Shanghai is actually 40th out of 50 on the list of the most resilient cities in the world, whereas Vancouver is second. It's just behind Toronto in terms of its resilience. And later on, I'll show you a graph which shows kind of how this affects investment value or investment sentiment. So, this issue of kind of resilience and sustainability has moved beyond being a nice to have and an interesting topic to being something of real relevance and interest to investors and property developers as they're seeking kind of more metrics and better intelligence of where they invest and where they put their money. And one of the things to say about Shanghai is that, as we probably appreciate, it's very congested, it's very polluted. But the reason why it scores badly in terms of resilience is its adaptive capacity. Shanghai is not showing a great kind of ability to be able to adapt to its vulnerabilities and its circumstances. The kind of dictatorial approach, if you like, to infrastructure change and investment from the government means that it's very harsh environment for citizens to live in. Things are done to citizens that don't necessarily help them in the way they live. There's a lack of consultation. So that's really affecting its ability to change and to respond to the situations around it. In comparison, Vancouver has got huge, very high levels of accountability and a good level of governance. 35,000 people participated in the development of the Greenest City 2020 action plan. 35,000 citizens actively engaged in that action plan. It's got an excellent adaptive capacity. So people are really engaged in how the city should change. They're really engaged in making things happen. And that means that Vancouver is rated 2 out of 50. So in terms of how they attract investment and how they attract capital into Vancouver to help its future investment, that's a great advantage. So the question is, how are successful cities working with their citizens? How are people sort of tapping into the power of people? And I'd like to kind of showcase one of our partners, which is Barcelona, because they're doing some very exciting things in terms of citizen engagement. And of course, like all cities, they're seeking to improve and modernize their infrastructure. They're looking at mobility, they're looking at fiber optics, they're looking at new energy networks. And what's interesting about Barcelona is the way citizen engagement is really embedded into their governance structures. So this shows a new entity that Barcelona created a year ago called the Urban Lab, where they're bringing lots of departments together into one building to really enable more faster working and communication between different departments, and actually providing a kind of a one-stop shop for citizens on any issue they may face in the city. And the box here in the top right-hand corner, which describes city challenges and citizen needs, is an interesting one, because it's where they're engaging with citizens on what do they see as the challenges, and actually going out there and sort of open sourcing, if you like, what do citizens feel need to change in Barcelona. And this is a list of the things that citizens came back with. What you can see from this list is when you think about, how do you reduce bicycle theft, how do you improve the social care through mobile devices, How do you do automatic system of detection for damaged pavements? So much of this involves actually citizens as part of the solution. You need strong citizen involvement, participation to make these things happen. And that's what Barcelona is striving for. They're even going now to the next stage. They call it Barcelona 5.0, where they're saying we can provide data back to citizens, of course, and many cities are providing data and information back to citizens. But could we give them some control over their infrastructure and their environment as a result of having that data? And they're experimenting with a particular district in Barcelona where they're saying, here's what's happening in terms of your community, here's what's happening in terms of your environment, here's some sort of decisions you can make, some control you can take. And so they're actually experimenting with really driving governance and control down to the citizen district level. We'll see how that goes. It's early days, but it's an exciting example of how they're leveraging their people power. City of Tallinn, they made all their bus transport free a couple of years ago. It's free to travel on buses now in Tallinn. It's one of the first, well, it's not the first time it's been done in the world, but it's certainly one of the first recent projects in Europe where they've experimented with this. Big question is, how do they afford that? How do you afford giving everybody a free bus travel? Well, the situation in Tallinn is they had about 20,000 people living in Tallinn who were not registered with the city government. They're not paying taxes, and they're just kind of in the informal economy. By providing free bus passes, the condition is that you need to have an ID card. You need to be registered with the government. So actually, their tax revenues have gone up to help close the gap in terms of the additional cost of public transport. Congestion has gone down. If you like, the kind of retail spend has gone up. So more people are able to move around the city. So the actual GDP, the gross domestic product of the city, is going up. So there's lots of macro and microeconomic indicators showing that this policy is beginning to work. And they're also experimenting with making their planning system more democratic. So they're talking about kind of locally led planning frameworks where there's a much higher level of governance. And they've even introduced a thing called the e-citizen, where you can become a citizen of Estonia even though you live outside of Estonia. And the idea is that there are lots of people around the world who are moving around, don't really have a home anymore, but they need to have kind of services. And why don't we just offer them Estonia as a country they can virtually live in and provide them all the services they need? So we'll see how far that goes. And I wanted to highlight to you a couple of 2 or 3 kind of startup organizations that we're working with that I think are very exciting in terms of leveraging people power. One of them is called City Insights. In the UK, we now have about 71% of people have a smartphone in their pocket. So we have an incredibly high smartphone usage in the UK. So we have a very powerful tool in our pockets. The question is, how can we use that kind of rich multimedia, high bandwidth, rich information source to make our cities better? And I think City Insights have come across something which can really help that. They provide basically context or location-sensitive information to you. So they started off in the kind of cultural sector, providing information on what exhibits were happening. So maybe the Tate Britain next door, for example, would have a system which showed you, what you're looking at essentially. They moved that outside, so places like Cambridge and Oxford, where you're moving around the streets, you could find out what's happening in the street. You could find out some history about that street, what happened there 500 years ago, what are the plans for this street. And then almost accidentally, they got introduced to Overbury, who's a property company that specializes in office fit-outs. And Overbury said, could you provide us a solution which provided a more smooth handover to clients when they move into one of these properties? So could you provide a kind of a multimedia access to how does this piece of equipment work? How do I use the boiler? Where do I find the services? Where's the water stop-off point? All these kind of things. And indeed, they built on the same platform that kind of rich information source. And what they also found was this was a very useful tool for the contractors working on site. So contractors, as you know, coming in and out site all the time, things are changing, where do they find things, who do they talk to? So they've built this system which can be used almost from cradle to grave as you're digging a hole in the ground, you're putting the hoardings up around a place. Citizens can engage with that development and say, yeah, what's happening here? I've got a hoarding saying, new development coming, but what's it going to be? What impact is it going to have on me as I walk up and down the street every day? Are they going to close the street? Well, if you subscribe, we can tell you about what's happening. Also, we'll tell you about what's coming. And maybe if you're interested in buying a place, we can tell you about what apartments you can buy. Once you've bought the apartment, we can tell you about how to use the services. Suddenly you've got a kind of an end-to-end solution that's very useful for all city leaders, planners, citizen engagement, property professionals, investors, and sellers, all in one platform. Very exciting tool. And then I think the next stage is, if you imagine the data they'll have as they roll this out across many property developments across the country, it'll be incredibly useful data on how people are engaging with a particular development as it goes on. Another example is Commonplace. They saw the fact that people had a sort of limited opportunity to engage with what was happening in their particular community. Now, you could engage with the local council, you can maybe go to a kind of an open evening, but really in today's kind of social media enabled society, there must be a better way in which we can kind of bring communities around. So Commonplace creates a platform where you can really engage in local issues. And again, it's an exciting opportunity to bring people in to give their views and opinions on what they want from a place. People actually really do care about their local environments, and they do have a perception about what's good and what's bad. And Alan talked about sort of modelling and about sometimes, we have great data, and planning organisations often have great data, but one of the things that we lack perhaps is to really know what people really want, what do they think, what are their perceptions, and to gather that data in a kind of enough volume and in an analytical way that you can really decide on what's the best for the citizen. Also, this is a platform that builds trust and transparency. So sure, we have our kind of consultations as a property development industry or as a city administration, but this really takes this to another level. It dramatically increases engagement, and also it increases engagement with the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So often people that we don't engage with very well as a population. Also, it's found that it's dramatically increased engagement with a diversity of sectors. So from all kind of ethnic backgrounds are able to engage in this system. Again, sort of communities that were in the past hard to reach. So working with Waltham Forest on implementing a new kind of cycling system. They're working with Grosvenor actually on their estate and how they engage with the people in the Grosvenor estate. And they're working with the Greenwich on the introduction of driverless cars. And I was fascinated to hear that their system enables people as they're in the driverless car to respond to, how do they feel about that sudden deceleration when somebody walked out in front of the car. But as well as that, they're also saying, what do the people in the street think about that driverless car as it suddenly stopped? What was their reaction? And so it's gathering information from Twitter and from social media, and they're able to combine the data about people's experience on the street with people's experience using a piece of new infrastructure, you could say. And I thought that was pretty fascinating how you can put those two pieces together. We're just got introduced to a company in Sweden called Bumblebee. And Bumblebee has a Wi-Fi solution for a city which enables you to analyze how people are moving and flowing through a city with a proprietary Wi-Fi system. And what they were able to help the city of Västerås to do was to work out where they put their bicycle hire, parking stations. So when you're implementing one of these kind of bicycle systems, like our Boris bikes here, how do you know where to put the cycling stations? Well, by tracking people's movements with Wi-Fi, they were able to work out exactly where to put them, and they were able to kind of save the cost of putting stations in places where they were planning to, where actually people didn't want to use them. So there's lots of examples of how we're starting to use data. That's the good news. The bad news. So last month, with the kind support of BRE, I ran a roundtable at MIPIM with city leaders talking about the future of cities. And actually, the topic I wanted to talk about was when we're doing multiple interventions in cities, we're doing a development here, we're doing a development there, how do you make sure those developments are not competing with each other or do not combine in such a way that has a result that you didn't want to see? How do you really combine things together? So that was the topic. And I couldn't get people off the topic of citizens. It was like all that everybody wanted to talk about was citizen engagement and citizen power. And one of the things that really struck me was this quotation from Natalie from Montreal, who is working on property developments with local communities. And she certainly saw that people were much more engaged and people really had a power and passion to be involved in their cities. But the city planners and the city institutions were not able to respond to this or reacting to this. So if you like, her view was that the future city opportunities were not filtering down fast enough, you could say, to the kind of ways in which we manage our cities. And that was echoed by lots of different people. And I guess, Alan, you did mention something about the fact that maybe, planners are not embracing some of the modelling tools. And it is a challenge, isn't it? I know from the work that we do with planners, they're incredibly busy and challenged trying to deal with all the things that are happening in cities. And it's a hard beast to change. We are in our silos, we do have our governance systems, and that's probably the biggest challenge. And I've talked a lot about the kind of good news story about how we can change cities and make cities better. But there's also a warning. And again, this kind of comes out of the Grosvenor report, and it's something we're very familiar with. Things like climate change, resource depletion. We have some major challenges in our cities. And so the ability to adapt and to deal with vulnerability is key to the success of future cities. And so not only do we need to improve the way we engage with citizens so that we can make the most of these new tools coming through, but also we need to improve the way we adapt, because change is coming, and it's coming rapidly. And those cities that don't adapt and are unable to adapt are going to be in the least resilient quadrant. And the warning is you'll find it harder to raise capital. So we're talking to property investors who are actively divesting from cities that have a less resilient outlook or less resilient systems. And they're increasing their investment in cities that are showing to be adaptive and fast-moving. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the biggest cities. So I think it's very interesting a few decades ahead in terms of some of the more small and nimble cities who are maybe able to adapt faster. So it's going to be a challenge for London, New York, and Toronto and Tokyo and these kind of cities to remain at the top. And maybe it's opportunities for the Manchesters and the Barcelonas and the Helsinkis to make a bit of progress. So, power to the people. Thank you.
So thank you, Peter, for the earlier welcome. It's great to be here. Great to see some familiar faces and many new ones as well. I think my talk follows on really nicely from the previous two talks, setting out some of the data landscape and particularly placing the emphasis on the people-centric aspect of cities and the kinds of city initiatives we're seeing developing at the moment. I committed to talking about what we mean by open data, translating the challenge of data into more practical examples. And I decided to exercise a bit of poetic license and distill this down to seizing the open data opportunity in cities. Because I really want to emphasize the role of openness in data, in cities in general. And I really want to illustrate examples of initiatives we've seen to date, but also to look forward to what the kinds of principles that we need to follow, the kinds of initiatives that might stem from application of those sorts of principles. So, as Peter said, I'm head of research at the Open Data Institute. It's a pretty awesome job. Very lucky to be in that position. And within the ODI, we do a bunch of work across training, research. We have a corporate member network of over 120 companies now, of which we're very pleased to say that BR is one of our corporate supporters. And amongst all the swathe of different application areas that we could choose to really drill down on the open data opportunity, we've chosen smart cities and agri-tech or agri-food as examples where we see massive scale of opportunity in terms of impact and massive challenges through the kinds of issues that we've seen around resilience, around increasing population, and in the agri-food sector around increasing or decreasing food scarcity, feeding a growing world population. As an organisation, we're a non-profit, non-partisan company. We're founded in 2012 by Tim Berners-Lee and Nigel Shadbolt, with seed funding initially from the UK government. Our headquarters are over that way in in East London, just near Old Street Roundabout. And if I had to define the organisation in one phrase, it would be about open data culture. So it's about helping people to understand the essence of open data culture, and also the practical benefits and the means that they might, the routes they might follow to realise those benefits through application of that culture. And I wanted to talk very briefly about a specific open data opportunity that I encountered here today on the way to the convention. I arrived at Paddington this morning, and having checked Google Maps for the best route to the venue, then found at least 3 different public transport routes. Chose the Bakerloo line option because it's the highest frequency, and rather than a 10-minute wait on the Circle line, get to the Bakerloo line platform, get on the train, wait for a few minutes, and I'm told that actually there's a broken down train some way down the line, the other side of the river from Paddington, and I have the option of waiting or I have the option of changing and taking a different route. And at that point in time, I'm saying, well, by the time I've walked the 5 minutes to the Circle line platform and potentially waited 10 minutes, then that's a 15-minute wait, but I have no visibility of the likely resolution time for a broken down train some way further down the line. So some kind of optimization of that sort of travel situation would be incredibly useful to me. It would be incredibly useful to the conference organisers who kind of had a bit of a sweat when I turned up 10 minutes before the start of the session. And those problems are solvable, but they're solvable with closed data, but it's a darn sight easy with open data. What we have is increasing data about public transport routes and frequencies, but we don't have insight into the kinds of issues like, okay, in the hundreds of other cases where a train has broken down on this particular tube line, N stations away from the current location, what is the likely resolution time across all those different cases? If we had access to that data, we can start to do more complex modelling, more sophisticated modelling that would say to those organisations, those passengers, likely resolution time 10 to 20 minutes. So we don't have that. Even the staff within London Underground don't have access to this kind of information, it seems, because I leave the Bakerloo line platform, I walk to the Circle line platform, and I hear an automated announcement telling me that there's a good service on all London Underground lines. So, draw your own conclusions. The message here is we can do these sorts of things with a lot of the data that we have. A lot of it is closed, but it's a darn sight easy with open data, because there's more people that can get eyes on the data, more people that can bring their technical skills and their creativity to solve the problem. So to talk briefly about what we mean by open data, it's data that anyone can access, use, and share. Crucially, it needs an open license. So there's kind of open by intention, and then there's open by law. So there's plenty of cases where someone collects a piece of data, maybe from a piece of research, they put it on the university website and say, here's my data, please reuse it for some interesting project of your own. The intention is openness, but it's not legally licensed. They've put it on the web so that it's accessible, but they haven't said to people that might want to use that, I declare here in a legally defensible form that you can use this data for whatever purpose you like. And without that kind of clarity around legal terms of reuse, people aren't going to create businesses or applications on that. They might spend a few hours playing around with it, but they're not going to devote their evenings, their weekends, their houses, their homes, their livelihoods to creating businesses and applications based on that. So it's really, really important that we have data that's explicitly licensed with open licenses. So at the risk of sparking a debate with Alan, I'd like to I'd like to introduce like a kind of a level 0 on his categorization of data sets from earlier, to say that things like Twitter data it might be accessible, but it's not strictly open in legal terms. There are very precise restrictions on how that data is actually used. Likewise, ANPR data, mobile phone data, it might be accessible to certain individuals. Companies like Telefonica, who are another one of our corporate partners, have experimented with opening subsets of that data for analysis. But for obvious reasons, it's very, very controversial, it's very thorny, there are lots of understandable privacy concerns around that. But above that, there is a layer of stuff that isn't controversial. It doesn't provoke the same kind of intellectual and emotional concerns that some of the stuff around personal movements might do. So, for example, on the one hand, tracking mobile phone locations will tell you a lot about someone's location. They might be at a bus stop. They might not want to know people to know that they're at a bus stop, but the fact that there is a bus stop at that precise location, there's nothing particularly controversial about that. That's the data that can be open very easily without getting into legal and ethical minefields. So, as a number of the speakers have mentioned, then we're at a place where there's widespread availability of this kind of data in a project that we have with the ODI and a bunch of other partners around Europe called opendataMonitor.eu. We've identified over 220 data catalogues across EU member states so far. Some of these are national level data portals, some of them are city and regional level. And my fag packet maths, I predict that in the next year, by the end of 2016, we'll see over 500 of these. And this is simply based on the number of cities that we have within the EU above a certain threshold size. I think 100,000, population of 100,000. I think that cities understand the opportunity in terms of promoting their city, their economy, their citizens, to attract inward investment, to attract migration to their cities, to attract university students. And I think it's reasonable to expect that cities of that size will have the resources and also the motivation to launch open data portals of their own. So aside from solving my issues with the Bakerloo line, what kind of things can people do with open data? I'm going to run through a number of quite kind of well-known examples, but just try and ground this in some urban contexts. This is the crime maps from police.uk, which are a few years old. This is the area around this Clifton Street in Shoreditch, where the ODI is based. And from this I can find from publicly accessible crime data that there were 4 crimes reported here in February 2015. 3 of them were vehicle crime. I don't drive a car into London, so I'm not too worried about theft from a person. Well, 1 incident of that. I might be careful when I leave the office, but maybe not. If you look at this for your own home neighbourhood, then the stats are probably far worse than this. So, kind of getting mugged near the office is probably the least of my issues. This is one of a well-known kind of suite of initiatives that people have done with open data about traffic accidents, particularly with respect to cyclists and pedestrians. So this is saying for London, and these are over a period of, I think, 10 years from around 2004 to 2013, I think the data is. Traffic incidents in London involving pedestrians or cyclists. Now, if we're thinking about how we improve our cities, how we use open data to do that, then really understanding where those black spots are so that we can adjust the routing or the signage in the cycling lanes. This is a huge issue in London. It's absolute, it's not a trivial example like me being delayed by 15 minutes on the tube. This is people's lives. So when we think about specific social impact of these kinds of open data initiatives, and the potential is huge. It's also an environmental impact, because if people are hearing stories in the news about the number of cyclists being killed on the streets of London, then they're just not going to do it to the same extent they would if they felt there was a safe environment for transport. This is a project we did at the ODI, which was prompted by Boris's initiative to rationalise the number of fire stations in London, and the decision about which stations to close was taken based on a closed piece of research that was conducted by a commercial company under contract, and all we heard were the results. We didn't understand the modelling that had been used. We didn't have access to the workings out. It's not like a kind of school exam where show your workings, and even if you get the answer wrong, then you still get some credit for it. It's like this is the answer, and behind that is a black box that doesn't give any potential for citizen engagement in understanding the decision making. If someone says to me, "We're going to close your fire station," you say, "Why?" You say, "Well, someone else says so." Then the potential for you to really feel acceptance of that decision is particularly limited. It also doesn't give you the chance to challenge it based on the same kind of data resources that are available to the company that are conducting the analysis. So we took open data about fire incidents and response times, like for the first appliance to arrive at the scene, and basically created this tool to allow people to simulate the closure of particular fire stations and the impact that would have on response times in different boroughs. And what we actually found, if we replayed the analysis, was that we came to pretty much the same conclusions as the guys that had done this in a back room somewhere using closed methodology, which is really interesting. So it could be spurious. It could be that actually just by chance we've come up with the same conclusions. But it could be that actually their methodology is perfectly sound. But why not do this in the open? This is a way that people can actually understand the process, they can replicate it, and they can find actually, yes, it might feel on the surface level like a kind of a risk to my neighbourhood, a risk to my home and my family, but actually it has no practical difference, even though the fire station is the one that's left open is half a mile down the road. But this isn't just London examples. This is a kind of crowdsourcing project in Detroit, motor city mapping, where the scale of the urban depopulation is so immense. It's just inconceivable in a city like London. That the scale of empty properties, rundown properties, is so phenomenal that this project was created to try and map this and understand how, based on that data, how do we actually address this? Do we encourage people to buy a house for $1 and move in, get their friends to buy the one next door and regenerate? Do we bulldoze the whole lot and have massive parks, or turn it back to nature? Who knows? But until the data's there, then you can't really take those sorts of decisions. How am I doing for time?
You're doing good.
Okay.
How much longer are you going to be?
Well, it's a circular question. Yeah. Okay. Not longer. 3 or 4 minutes, I think. So it's also not developing economies that we're talking about here. This is an initiative from Kenya. The map happens to be centered on Nairobi, but it's a nationwide initiative about discovering schools nearby. So not so much in central Nairobi, but in other areas of the developing world, then the issue is not the first world problem of which of the many awesome schools near me do I send my kids to? I've been through this recently in my hometown of Bristol, and we're surrounded by good schools on one side and perfectly satisfactory schools on another. How do we choose? First world problem. In other areas of the developing world, then it's like, well, which schools have running water, and how far is the walk? And I don't mean I don't mean in minutes, but in miles, potentially hours every day, and not over the land that you can get your kid on a little micro scooter to get them to school faster. So this is something that is of impact on a global scale. It's something that has potential impact for everyone, irrespective of walks of life. It's not just Shoreditch hipsters that are benefiting from this or building apps on this. It's something that people are looking at across all different continents to solve all sorts of different problems. These opportunities are economic, social, and environmental. This is the only way to really scale up the wealth of different initiatives that are taking place and understand the scale of the opportunity. If I had to say that, where do we go from here? When we think about a smart city, I've made a big pitch now for the importance of open data in freeing people up to innovate with the data that's available to help them solve problems that are of particular significance to them or where they see a commercial opportunity. But beyond that, then, if we want a smart city, then it's got to be open along a number of different additional dimensions. Open data, I've spent most of my time pitching for that. But again, and I should have injected open licensing in here, in between the data and the standards. At a technical level, this data has to be available according to certain standards that pave the way for people to make best reuse of it. If it's buried in Excel files or even worse, PDFs, people say, great, I've got some open data. It's a bunch of tables in a PDF document on our website. Or even worse, it's something like a JPEG image of a table embedded in a PDF, and then zipped up and then put on the website. This is strictly speaking, you could say it's open data, but really, in terms of the barriers of reuse, it's easier to look at a centuries-old ledger of ship records on paper and OCR it. It was as easy to do that as it is to extract the tabular data from PDF in some cases. So we really need to think about how we as data owners or data publishers can encourage people to adopt best practices and standards. We have a project called Open Data Certificates at the ODI, which is basically a way of allowing people to add a kite mark to their data saying we followed best practices to one of 4 different levels. It's also like a training tool for people to understand the hoops they need to jump through to comply with best practices. But at a city level, it also got to be about open infrastructure. These 220 plus open data portals in EU countries, that's great, but that's something that's owned typically by the local administration. It sits somewhere in a data centre. It might be London's open data portal or Bristol's open data portal or Helsinki's open data portal. But is it really for and by the citizens of that city? I'd say probably not. It's something that's that's done from the top down with great intention and goodwill, but it doesn't address infrastructure that operates at the neighbourhood level. It's part of the picture rather than the total solution. So back to the previous talk, the emphasis here, if we want to be really effective in applying data to smart city initiatives, then our starting point has to be people-centred outcomes, defining what these are, what we want to achieve and how we're going to get there, not by starting first with technology solutions. And unfortunately this, in terms of technology solutions, has dominated the smart cities discourse to date. And I see now in 2015 a change, I think reaching a kind of tipping point in the discourse, tipping point in the narrative where, say, the community-centred, people-centric initiatives that come bottom up are the way that we're actually going to affect real change in combination with top-down initiatives, but it's not going to come all from the top down. I think that's why Shanghai, to Brian's point, why Shanghai, its adaptability is through the floor. So it's not just about the technical aspects, it's about a culture of openness where everyone can participate and everyone can benefit from the interventions and the outcomes. So thank you very much.
Stand in front.
Let's stand in front, okay.
Yeah. Come, gentlemen, come join me at the front. Can you hear me? Great. We're going to stand up so you can see who we are rather than...
Keeps it energized.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm going to speak to you first, actually. A wonderful start. Absolutely wonderful. A great overview, picture, perspective, followed by some amazing examples of how this whole thing connects to people's virtual Estonia and all sorts of other things. Amazing. The resilience issue, that was really interesting. And then you followed up, Tom, with also some really wonderful examples, but also actually very much complimented Sir Alan in some of the practicalities about how we go about doing this in the right way. So, tremendous start to our conference. Thank you very much. Now, are there any questions from people, please, that would like to pose? Yeah. Would you mind standing up, saying who you are?
John Burke, Zero Energy Systems. Thank you for mentioning privacy late on in the talk, because that's one of the key issues that was brought up yesterday when I went to the Unified Communication Expo. One of the major problems they have with opening up systems is vulnerability. You open up a system, you're inviting in hackers and all sorts of people, and that was a real major concern at that exhibition. Now that is the downside of open data. How would you address that? How would you compartmentalise systems? Or how would you actually secure real data of personal issues? I mean, for instance, I turn off my iPhone trackability, and I don't want people to know where I am. I mean, I could be a government minister in a brothel, and people don't want to know about that, do they really, except the newspapers? But this is what you're suggesting. So,
okay, great
answer
question.
a few of those questions.
So before you do, does anyone else have a question? Yeah, would you like, I'm going to take 3 questions now and then we can distribute them. Your question, please.
Right, thank you. Hisham Fadi, I'm the dean at Southern University. 30 years ago, we started a regional research laboratory. I was lucky to start that in the UK. And we expected at the time, with the development of GIS and so on, that data would be faster, would be more dynamic, would be flowing. And so what we describe these days is an extension of that expectation. But is there an idea of how this might be changed? We have a little bit of change of how we put data into genetic memories or the nature of data as an ecological system. because that will change completely how we think about the structure of data, and I wouldn't differentiate between people and data really. I mean, we all would think it can be combined together. So I'm not
Okay,
sure.
thank you very much. And third question, Daniel.
I would like to ask a question rather than make a statement. I wanted to pick up on Alan's application 1, the public sector. I find it amazing that how little modelling is used in the public sector, and particularly the planning department in projections and looking at future cities when they're looking 30 years ahead. There seems to be a real gap there. Because modelling can come into its own in terms of the planning, in terms of decision making, and actually far more improved efficiencies. My question is, how do you encourage and give that incentive to the local authorities really to get to grips with that? Because there is a powerful tool, systems of systems that needs to be taken on board and very quickly. There's the crisis that we have with the housing and all this projection of new cities that we need.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is just reflect back to a very brief summary of the 3 questions in case you didn't hear it. The first one's about security, protection, privacy. The second one is about more dynamic
A different type of
different type,
ecological system and data.
which is sort of what I think Sarana, you were talking about moving towards. And the third one is how do we up the capability of the public sector to better use the opportunities, better deploy the opportunities that arise from doing something. So over to you in no particular order.
Can I first go on the third question, which is really familiar for me. When your diagnosis is absolutely correct, it's something I've been preaching for decades, but this will happen. It's an interesting question about why it doesn't happen, and it actually connects to the second question. And what I was going to say in response to that is there is a cycle of fashion. I've been very fashionable in modelling. Decades ago, I had a long period of being unfashionable, and I'm suddenly fashionable again. It's very nice for me, because models are needed in this territory. So how do we go about it? I mean, there are plenty of us who understand the need. How do we get it into the planning profession? I have an opportunity through the Foresight project to do some demonstrations in relation to scenario planning with models. We're actually working directly with Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester, Cardiff. And interestingly, it's not often the planners. Or Bristol, you have people like Steve Hilton, who has the title of Director of Futures, and Steve will want to get into this kind of thing. And I think what will happen is that innovation will, in the first instance, happen outside planning, and then it will move into planning. I remain the optimist that we will actually get there in the end.
Could I share your optimism? Could I see you afterwards?
Just check, can we all hear? Do I need a microphone for the speakers? No, you can all hear, okay.
I'd just like to pick up on the planning point as well, and I'm a great believer that cities will learn from each other. So cities often get inspired by what they see other cities doing. Planning by its nature is kind of risk averse. It's about making sure.
Just for recording purposes.
Sure. It's making sure that all the as much as possible, all the conditions are taken care of. So quite rightly, we do want our planners to get it right, to take their time. I had an interesting chat with Martin before this started about at this round table we had at MIPIM last month. One of the chief architects from Helsinki said, sometimes it's good that planning is slow. We're talking about smart cities and go faster and data and everything's happening, and actually, when you think about putting some hard infrastructure in the ground or some major changes to buildings that are going to be there for 20, 30, maybe 50 years, you don't want to kind of rush into doing something on the basis of a trend or an issue. You want to get it right. So I think it is a slow process. It is happening. I think absolutely Alan's right that maybe through their colleagues, through the kind of smart cities work or environmental work, of course working with developers who are using a lot of modelling tools in terms of how they're modelling their developments, we'll see more of these tools coming into place. but it will be a slow process. So I think, de-risking it by working with those cities who are far ahead and really helping them to share their experience to de-risk it as much as possible.
Okay. Tom, can you not answer that question?
I actually wanted to answer that.
I want to answer the privacy question
Sure.
and the ecologically dynamic data question.
Okay.
In a sort of fairly succinct way.
In a fairly succinct 30 seconds, yeah, perfect. Yeah. I think the first thing to say on the privacy aspect is for us all to work really hard to help the world at large understand there is a spectrum here. There's a huge spectrum from national security and state secrets at one end, whatever you think of those, to facts at the other end of the spectrum that can't be licensed because they're just facts. They can't be copyrighted. And in the middle, then there's open data that's shared, maybe between government departments or service providers, and then there's closed data that might be the Tesco Club Card database. Yeah, and personal data can occur at a number of those. There's very clear guidance around the intersection between personal data and open data. There's clear guidance. There are still grey areas. I could choose to monitor my blood pressure and publish that data under an open license. Or publish my home postal address and phone number. Have that right. I think the important thing is understanding there is that spectrum. I think it relates to the previous question. We're all as a planet on a massive data journey. We're just right at the start of it. We need to pick off the low-hanging fruit and tread very, very carefully into the difficult areas. There's been some snafus, some personal data snafus. We saw one in New York a few months back around taxi routing. Exactly. Open data and personal data are the Venn diagram isn't completely distinct, but it's only there's only very partially overlapping, and helping people to understand and develop their own nuances around the different aspects of data is the only way that we can really do that.
Any thoughts for our other?
The security issues are major.
I'm going to allow you to have a really ruddy break. Coffee, just because I want to get everybody else to coffee as well.
Yeah.
And if any of you want to cluster and get involved in this important topic, just get in there. But I would like
sure
an answer to the challenging ecologically dynamic data question.
Yeah, I'm not. I would just say that actually the data security and openness of data are kind of orthogonal issues. That you can have as closed data as you like, that's still vulnerable to penetration. So I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but I think that there's. I'll maybe try and give a general statement that there is. I think it comes back to Sir Alan's point that it's there's the kind of core reference data that's not particularly dynamic. Once a decade census data. And then there's stuff that's happened, the presence of all of us in this room right now for the next 30 seconds while I finish my answer, and then we're off to coffee. They're very dynamic. They need different data models. They need different kind of mechanisms for storage, for processing, for querying, for interlinking. We're at the moment, each of those different solutions or approaches is typically quite siloed. What we're trying to move towards in the ODI and our broader research community is a web of data where this stuff can come together using the infrastructure of the web as the best mechanism we have for connecting stuff where it's right to connect it.
Okay, Sir Alan, just final.
Yeah, very, very briefly on the ecosystem side. I mean, what working in a government context on future policy as a modeller has made me realise is, I've been working with models that are inadequate for a number of current policy questions, and not least the whole arguments about sustainability, low carbon targets, and this kind of thing. And it means we need to integrate models of energy and material flows. We need to think about ecosystem services, and we need to start bolting new submodels onto the diagram that I actually showed you earlier. So I'm very conscious of that, but it's really big research territory.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your thoughts. Do go now and enjoy coffee. You're back here at 10:02 for the next session, which is going to be chaired by Brian. And let's finish by giving a hearty round of applause to our tremendous speakers. Thank you.